The topic of other power is a very broad one, so one could talk about a number of different aspects to it. When I think about my own history with Buddhism, I've been very fortunate in having some rather wonderful teachers. And when I think about it, one thing that immediately strikes you is that from one's own perspective, how random this is. How on earth did I bump into these remarkable people? It feels like a sort of miracle, you know. It isn't that I went through a directory and looked them all up and found them and then went and went searching. They appeared. Of course, I had an interest, so when they were giving talks or something, I would go. But there's an element about it that feels a bit miraculous. And when I think about my interaction with Chogyam Trungpa or with Kenneth Roshi or others, it's true that they taught me some facts, some theories, some techniques, and they had their favorite techniques of this meditation or that meditation or whatever. But I'm rather doubtful that that was the most powerful element in what happened in my time with them. Much more the case that what was powerful was, what can you say, the relationship, something intangible that went on between myself and that person, a kind of heart-to-heart connection of some kind. And this, I think, must have been the case with people meeting Shakyamuni Buddha. In the sutras, there are many accounts of encounters with the Buddha. In fact, probably the majority of sutras are of that type. Such and such a person comes to see the Buddha, has some interaction, and goes away a changed person. And this seems to happen rather swiftly. Well, I've been to many Buddhist schools and so on, where you ask about practice and so on, and people say, well, it takes a long time, you know. But when you read the sutras, it seems to happen almost in a trice. People are changed by an interaction with the Buddha. And some of the people who interact with the Buddha have themselves done a lot of spiritual practice, but it's by no means all of one type. Some of them are ascetics, some of them are Brahmins, some of them are Buddhist monks, and so on. They all have different practices. And there's quite a number of people in the sutras who have no religious practice at all. They've never done any meditation or anything of that kind. And the most classic case in Pure Land tradition is Queen Vaidehi, who's evidently a rather worldly woman who's lived in the upper echelons of the political power game. And she has this, she finds herself in this terrible circumstance, and the Buddha comes to see her. And she has a great vision of the Pure Land, a big spiritual awakening as a result of half an hour's conversation, maybe less. And Ananda, who has done years and years and years of meditation and practice, basically says, oh, what happened there? Can you teach me to do that? and he wants a technique, he wants a method, and the Buddha obliges. The Buddha gives him a way of visualizing something sort of like the Pure Land by a contrived practice of visualization. But one has a distinct sense that this is not the real thing in quite the sense that it was for Vaidehi, whose realization came out of a pressing emotional and psychological need, you might say. And so part of the idea of other power is like this, that things come into your life and may change you radically, or may change you in small ways, and that are unforeseen, that are not a consequence of your own practice, that are not a consequence of self-power. And so this distinction is made in Buddhism between self-power and other power. Self-power being the idea that we have within ourselves the potential to enlighten ourselves, to, in a sense, achieve what Shakyamuni Buddha achieved. If saying he achieved something is even a meaningful statement. This is the idea of self-power. And so we have to find a method that will unlock that potential in ourselves. And this is the way that Buddhism is often presented. But either as a sort of supplement to that, or perhaps as a complete replacement to that, there is this notion of other power, that things come into our lives that completely change us. And this certainly would have been the case in a number of the instances where the Buddha encounters somebody, and as a result of that encounter, the person's life is changed. And the same, of course, is true in many of the lineage stories you have in Zen, particularly, in Karjapa, Tibetan Buddhism. You have these stories of the transmission of the Dhamma from generation to generation. And it's generally through a relationship, it's through an encounter between two people. Sometimes these encounters are sudden, abrupt, bring about some quick change. Sometimes they last over many, many years. One thinks of Milarepa with Marpa, where there was a whole succession of interactions that gradually turned Marpa from being a black magician into being a spiritual genius. That's quite a big shift. So it took more than one go, I think, to get him from one position to the other. And again, when you look at that story of Milarepa and Marpa, Marpa does in the end teach Milarepa to do meditation, but it's very much in the end. You read the book of the story of Milarepa, and it's not till right at the end that he starts doing meditation. Much of what goes on between Marpa and Milarepa is much more to do with building houses or moving rocks, or the sort of thing I spend a lot of my time doing out here in France, building walls and so on. So there's a point here about it not being exactly the technique. It's not a technique that matters. In my most recent podcast, I talked about the incident of the child Buddha, the Buddha to be, Siddhartha, and the incident of the rose apple tree and the ploughing festival. And in the what happens here is the little boy sees his father ploughing the field, and he's deeply affected by seeing the earth cut open and all the little animals in the earth that are turned up by the plow being eaten by the birds. And so he's faced with this, the existential reality that in order to live, we have to eat, and in order to eat, we have to destroy, because we have to grow the plants, or however, whatever it is we eat. There's always destruction involved. And so he's faced with an existential reality that is kind of, at this point, becomes inescapable. But why at this point? You know, it's like everybody else went to the ploughing festival, nobody else became enlightened. So there is something happened for Siddhartha Gautama at that point, which was rather remarkable. And it's so the matter of other power is about being open to this dimension of things and not having an attitude to our practice of trying to be totally in control. When we approach our practice as I just want to get the right technique, the right meditation, the right understanding of this or that book, and then everything, that's what enlightenment will consist of. This is a mistake. When enlightenment comes to you, and I'm using the term not necessarily just meaning total enlightenment like Shakyamuni Buddha, but when small breakthroughs in your spiritual life occur, they're probably going to be surprising. They're probably going to be unexpected. They're probably not going to be at all what you're anticipating. And they're probably not going to happen as a result of something in which you have control of the process that's happening. It's going to have much more the sense of something breaking into the trajectory of your life rather than something resulting from it. And so this is the sort of sense of other power. And there are quite a number of, for instance, of instances in Buddhist history where people's great teachers have become great teachers essentially because they had some vision or dream or something of that kind spoke to them. And so that a very famous case would be the Indian teacher Atisha, who became the one of the greatest gurus of Tibet eventually, but initially was in India, had a vision. Well, a vision. He heard a voice, which he took to be the voice of Avalokiteshvara, Kuan Yin, telling him to go to the teacher Selingpa, who was in a far distant country, was in Indonesia. And he had to make a long and perilous journey to go and see Selingpa. And then he came back to India after he'd spent a lot of time practicing with Selingpa. And he became a very famous and important teacher. And then some people came from Tibet and said, "Will you come to Tibet? We need a teacher like you in Tibet." and he thought, well, his rational mind told him this was a stupid idea. And again, he had another vision, which said to him, this will take 10 years off your life, but you must do it. And he went to Tibet and became one of the great teachers, and he attempted to he found a way of teaching the Tibetans, which was not at all easy, because they were not the sort of cultured people that he'd been used to in India by any means, and they weren't into reading books and so on. They were rather more rough and ready tribes people who were farmers and warriors. Anyway, the story of Atisha is another story. But in similar vein, in Pure Land Buddhism, Shinran, who became one of the great Pure Land teachers, studied with Honen, and he only went to Honen because he had a vision in the course of a retreat. He was on a retreat, and on the 95th day of this 100-day retreat, he had an appearance of Prince Shotoku, who had been the ruler who had brought Buddhism to Japan, telling him to go and see Honen, and this completely changed his life. And these are the sort of big instances where something has broken into a person's life and changed them in a radical sort of way. There have been many other great teachers in the history of perhaps I should tell you a little bit about the history of the notion of other power. In some ways, it all goes back to Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna was the usually thought of as great philosopher. He taught, he wrote treatises of dialectics, and many modern people have been very impressed by this, his philosophical writings. But he was also a devotee of Amitabha, and he coined the idea that in Buddhism there is an easy path and a difficult path, and on this basis, the difficult path is the path of hard practice, and the easy path is the path of faith. Of course, it's easy if you've got it. Faith isn't something you can contrive. People might say, oh, well, faith's the easy path. How can I get it? But this is a sort of contradiction of terms. Either you've got it or you haven't got it. And it's not something that you can plan or contrive. If you could plan and contrive it, it wouldn't be faith. It would be self-power practice. But anyway, Nagarjuna made this distinction. Of course, there's a sense in which everybody has faith. It's probably truer to say that it's not that people lack faith, it's that they've scattered their faith. They've attached it to many different things, and so you've got a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit somewhere else. And you can understand this as one of the ways of understanding the Buddha's teaching about non-attachment. That it's because we have attached we've broken our faith up into bits and attached it all over the place. Whereas what the Buddha would like is that it's concentrated, that our life is all of one piece, not just sort of strewn all over our world of experience. When you look at the great teachers, they have a certain sort of single-mindedness, and there's this kind of ekagata the Buddha talks about is essentially is a product of faith. Anyway, I was telling you a bit about the history. Nagarjuna coined this notion of easy practice and difficult practice. And this was developed somewhat by Vasubandhu, who we think came about 100 years later. And Vasubandhu was a great teacher of meditation. He's associated with the idea of the yoga kara, you say the kara, the method of yoga, meditation, and so on. But this was very, in the case of Vasubandhu, this was very much a devotional form of practice. He worshipped Amitabha as the Buddha of unimpeded light in all dimensions of the universe, and this is quite closely connected with the as many of these early teachers were, with a text that's hardly used these days, which is the Pratyutpana Samadhi Sutra. This was a very influential text in northern India, Mahayana, and then in China. And its basic idea is that the inspired mind sees Buddhas everywhere, sees Dhamma everywhere. There's a change of perception, you might say. But the Pratyutpana Samadhi is the samadhi in which you see Buddhas in all directions. And in particular, you see Amitabha Buddha. And this was one of the first texts then. So this text was much used by Vasubandhu, and he wrote a commentary. And then this text was translated into Chinese, and it was one of the first scriptures to arrive in China. And so the first we see of Pure Land Buddhism in China on any scale is the teacher Hui Yuan, who lived, I've got his dates, who lived 334 to 416. So this is sort of contemporary with, you might say, the later Roman Empire. So it gives you some idea of where we are in history. It's a very early date. And Hui Yuan and a group of people in China formed what was called the White Lotus Society. I think they say 123 people formed the White Lotus Society in the year 402. And this was a pledge. It was a group of people who pledged to all be born together in the Pure Land and to practice together to that end. And they based their practice on the Pratyutpana Samadhi Sutra. There weren't that many sutras in Chinese at that time. And then a couple of years after Hui Yuan had set up this society, Kumarajiva arrived. Kumarajiva is thought of as the great translator. He translated the Lotus Sutra and a number of other major Mahayana works. So this opened up a whole new chapter in Chinese Buddhism, because suddenly they had all these new books. Well, it also marked a change, because in order to translate these books, Kumarajiva coined quite a lot of new words and new terms. Up to that point, Buddhist texts had largely been translated into Chinese using Taoist terminology. That Kumarajiva kind of created in the linguistic level, he created Chinese Buddhism. He created a whole language of Chinese Buddhism, which is there to this day. And I don't read Chinese. I can work on a Chinese text, but I'm not fluent in Chinese. But I'm told that writing is particularly beautiful, and this also has an influence and is interesting from another power point of view. What on earth do we mean by beauty? Why are we touched by beauty? Why do we look at some things and go, how wonderful, like this? These also beautiful things are also things that are kind of other power that break into our life like this. And how did Kumarajiva manage to write such beautiful prose and so on? You know, when we talk about a great artist, we often, even now in our materialistic, mechanical world, we still talk about an artist being inspired by the muse. and an artist often does have that sense that they've just been a channel. You look at something, did I write that poem, or did I paint that picture? How did that happen? When a person is, in a way, under the influence, you might say. So a lot of what other power is about is these forces that, with modern psychology, you might call them the unconscious. But this is just a sort of modern metaphysic. I mean, nobody's ever seen an unconscious. They've never put an unconscious in a test tube or on a laboratory table. It's a modern metaphysical idea. But somehow we are inspired in one way or another. Something happens, and it's something that's has every feeling of being outside our own power. So Kumarajiva came along and wrote all this beautiful stuff and inspired many other people. And Hui Yuan, who formed the White Lotus Society, and Kumarajiva had many had an interesting correspondence and many interesting conversations. And then the next teacher of note would be Tan Luan. And Tan Luan was just about a generation later. And this is not untypical for Pure Land teachers, he had started off in a fairly strict Buddhist order. You know, he got ordained when he was quite young, as they did in those days. Well, still do in some countries. Thailand, you can get ordained when you're 14, probably. So he'd been ordained at an early age and practiced. And then he got sick, and he couldn't cope with this rather ascetic practice, and he got sick, and he went and studied for a while with Taoists, because the Taoists were more famous for their medicine and longevity and that sort of thing. So he studied Taoism, and then, as we can tell more as by chance, he met Bodhiruchi, who was an Indian monk who was traveling in China, who told him a completely different way of doing things. And he then became, through the influence of Bodhiruchi, who was very much influenced by Vasubandhu's commentaries, he became a great teacher of Pure Land Buddhism. And he was, in fact, Tan Luan was the first person to use the term other power to mean, in effect, the sort of positive side of dependent origination. We know that dependent origination, very central concept in Buddhism. Everything depends on conditions. And when you read the sort of classical descriptions of dependent origination, they show how on the basis of ignorance, concepts arise in the mind which condition your life and so on. And it talks about a sequence of basically how you become thoroughly deluded, and how once you are deluded, you stay that way because you keep going around in circles. And other power is in many ways the converse of this. If dependent origination is about the conditions that keep you deluded, other power is about the conditions that release you, that liberate you, that enable you to escape from this the wheel of dependent origination. And Tan Luan used the term in that way. And he inspired many disciples, and about 100 years later, there arose another teacher called Tao Cho. And he reformulated these same ideas, and he talked about the self-power approach as the path of sages. In other words, you had to be a sage to manage to do this, and I'll come back to that point in a minute when I mention Honen. And he contrasted this path of sages to the path of the Pure Land, and that's one of the ways in which all these ideas got sort of fixed together. But Tao Chou was also the teacher of Shandao, and Shandao was a great propagator of Pure Land teaching in China. I'm going to skip about 700 years and take us to Japan, where the key figure here is Honen. Because Honen was inspired by the writings of Shandao. So there's a sort of, you can see a sort of sequence here. And Honen had been looking for an approach to practice that was available to anybody, to ordinary people. He wanted something that could be a spiritual path for somebody who was a farmer or a fisherman, or because he lived in this feudal society in which people didn't have a choice. They couldn't go off to the monastery and study. Modern people in the 20th century, they can go to the bookshop and get a book, and they oh, this is interesting. Oh yes, meditation. Okay, I'll have a go at that. This wasn't really possible if you were a peasant in Japan in the 13th century. You had to just get on with your life and do whatever it was you'd been born to do. We have a society in which, at least in theory, people have what we call achieved status, like the job that you have, the life that you have, in theory, is the result of the effort that you've made in your education and the exams you've passed and so on. Whereas in the medieval feudal society, you were born to do this, that, or the other, and that was it. If you were born to cultivate the rice paddy, then that's what you did. There was no chance of changing that. So Honen wanted something that would reach people in any situation like this. People who were not in a position to do the self-power practices. And he was inspired by the writings of Shandao, and he arrived at this practice of the Nembutsu, which was essentially open your heart to Amida, and it may be that something will happen like that. So, but this was an opening up to the possibility of other power entering your life, which could enter anybody's life, not just. And one of the things that he then observed, Honen observed, was that even the people who did have the opportunity, the people who went to the great monastery at Mount Hiei and so on, where he had gone, they still didn't manage to achieve the levels of perfection that are asked for in the Buddhist texts. The 10 bodhisattva stages, nobody got to stage 10. The precepts, nobody manages to keep all these precepts. People in social life go around pretending that there's a good reason for everything they do and justifying all their actions. But actually, we're a ragbag of passions, and we make errors, and we're vulnerable, and we're sailing along nicely one day, and then we get a letter through the post and we feel dreadful for the next 24 hours, or we have a row with our son, or who knows what. And we're knocked off balance very easily. So we're very vulnerable creatures. And this is not at all what is required if you're going to be following the self-power practice. In fact, to follow the self-power practice, you'd have to already be a sage. So this takes us back to this notion of there's a path for sages, people who are extraordinarily well endowed, but for the great majority of people, not accessible. So I hope I've given you some sort of vague idea of what we mean by other power, and how it comes into one's life, and what influence it holding this kind of idea may have. You see, when people met Shakyamuni Buddha, and perhaps some change occurred, what would they have felt? Well, one of the things they'd have felt was great gratitude. When you have an other power orientation, you might say, towards your spiritual life, one of the things it gives rise to is a sense of great good fortune. Whereas if you have a self-power approach, you probably have more a sense of deficiency, of I've got further to go, I've got to go somewhere. But the other power approach tends to give you a sense of, oh, just thank you, Buddha. Thank you very much. And the Dharma is already in the world. And for that, we can be immensely grateful. And if we're touched by it, it may transform us. And often the way it touches us is through the relationships we have, how it is passed on from generation to generation. If you go back to what I said earlier about people meeting Shakyamuni, being affected, once he'd gone, people would say, well, what do we do now? Because he's gone. But it is passed on from generation to generation.